Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Way is in Training. This is a podcast exploring how warriors should train and fight, as well as how they should live. We will talk about technique, but we'll also dive deep into fitness, mindset, and strategy. We will explore leadership and philosophy as well. So whether you are a young soldier, a veteran police officer, a responsible armed citizen, or simply someone looking for an authentic life, let's examine how the lessons of combat and preparation for it can help us fulfill our potential. Let's explore the way together and learn how the discipline of training can show us our true selves amidst the chaos of life.
Hey everybody, I'm really looking forward to today's show. Our guest today is an old friend of mine who actually used to work for me in the Chicago Police Department. We've been friends for decades. Really good tactical trainer, very, very brilliant mind, and a really good Filipino martial artist. So I'm looking forward to just kind of seeing what rabbit hole of conversation we go down today and seeing where it takes us. So my buddy's name is Aaron Cunningham, retired Chicago cop, much like myself. Aaron, why don't you give everybody a little bit of detail on your background before we get started, and then we'll just take it from there.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'm honored to participate in the discussion for your listeners today. As you mentioned, I'm a 25-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department, retired. That included time spent under your leadership on the area gun team in Chicago. I've worked patrol, South Side, West Side, Chicago, predominantly tactical teams, federal task force. I was a district intelligence officer, and I worked at headquarters intelligence at the CPD Fusion Center. So I was lucky to put my hand in a few different pots in the Chicago Police Department while I was there.
All right, and let's talk about your martial arts background a minute. Let's let everybody know what you've got going on there, or what you've had going on there.
Sure. So as a child, I was drawn into the notion of practicing martial arts pretty strongly. Whatever book I could get my hand on, any media that came across, but I unfortunately didn't get a chance to train directly until 1981. So that's sort of when I began. And it was in Chicago at Daggerberg Academy, learning Filipino boxing, and then later joining into a Serrata Eskrima or a Nine Eskrima class at that time, the first one in the city. That in turn, several years later, led to meeting Angel Caballos when he visited Chicago, and his protege, Jimmy Tacosa. And I began formally training with Jimmy from that period until roughly 1989. I received an instructorship to teach Serrata Eskrima, and then began actively teaching classes from there.
And for those people who don't have any knowledge of like martial arts culture in Chicago, the Daggerberg Academy was this huge school in Lincoln Square that literally had classes in everything. But actually, like, classes with some legitimacy and everything, unlike a lot of what people would call like storefront dojos. Like the classes were legitimate. There was just a wide variety of things you could train in there. And in the Chicago area, it's everything. And it's pretty famous in the Chicago area as like being one of the original old school, like kind of dojo complexes in Chicago, I guess is the best way to put it. Yes.
Yeah, Fred Daggerberg himself is an icon, and he brought everything to the table from, JKD to Chinese martial arts, traditional Western boxing, grappling arts. I mean, everything has been taught in that building.
And it's, like I said, anybody who's interested in martial arts who's around our age in Chicago and even younger has seen the Daggerberg ads, right? And it's one of those things. It's an institution in that community in Chicago, without a doubt.
Yes.
Now we were talking before we started recording, and we've talked about this before because you and I go way back, but Like my background in FMA always came through JKD. So it was very kind of informal and kind of abbreviated. And hey, how did you put it before we were recording? They threw everything at us and like just kind of gave us a little taste of everything they'd seen, which is a pretty accurate, I think, statement. So
Right.
like
They would have thrown the kitchen sink at you.
yeah, pretty much. And that wasn't a bad thing necessarily, but like now that I'm retired, I'm kind of pursuing a little bit more of that because it's always interested me. And I'd like to have like a legitimate framework of knowledge in it, not just the smatterings I picked up as part of another art, right? And what always fascinated me about the Filipino arts that ties into all the shooting training I do now and the shooting competition I do now. And I'll circle back around to that in a second, but I really want your thoughts on this because I think you'll have some pretty insightful things to say. Is the Filipino arts, rather than starting out, most arts start out, if they're empty hand and weapon art combined, right? Most of those sorts of arts start out with the empty hand and then add in weapons later. Whereas the Filipino arts do it the other way around. And what I always thought was just brilliant, whether it was intentional or not, from like a learning standpoint, from the way the body and the brain works, is that the weapons move faster than the empty hand, right? Like when you've got a stick in your hand, the end of that stick is moving way faster than your hand can move. So you get used to seeing and reacting at a faster speed than you would if you were just doing empty hand stuff. And then when you go to the empty hand stuff, everything seems kind of slow. And it's kind of the same way with the action shooting I do, right? So like, except for outlier situations, you should probably very seldom shoot at the pace in a real event that you would shoot a USPSA stage adding competition, right? Because you're not shooting it tactically, you're shooting it for speed and precision combined. And your score is based on how many points you can collect in the shortest amount of time possible on the targets, right? Which is very different than a tactical consideration. Although the skills carry over, especially the skills you're developing. But one of the things that carries over that people I don't think really think about enough is not so much even a physical skill, but more an attribute. When you get used to operating at that speed with your firearm, I don't mean operating in the tactical buzzword sense, I mean just running the gun at that pace. Now, when I turn the dial back down to a more defensive or tactical pace, it seems very slow and relaxed because I've gotten used to going much faster. And I want to hear your thoughts on the Filipino arts because that's always been something that kind of stuck in my head, was that it seemed like a great way, even if you weren't somebody who cared about fighting with sticks or learning to fight with knives, working something so much faster than your empty hands enables you to be more acclimated to a higher speed. So when you go back down to the speed of your empty hands, it's much more comfortable. You're not overcome by information the same way. What do you think?
So I think a couple of words jumped out at me in particular, but especially the word relaxed, and because that refers both to your body, your breathing, and your mind, as well as posture. When you're looking for unexpected contact or unanticipated contact with violence or aggression. The Filipino martial arts emphasize that calm and that relaxation, and usually a neutral expression. So they're not the noisiest martial artists on the scene, that's for sure. And from a training perspective, typically, beginning with weapons and teaching basic, quick reactions to immediate attacks. They had you do that from sort of a neutral hands down stance, sort of what might appear to not even be ready. But we were always told that it was important not to give the enemy very much information, not to allow them to see you posture or take a position, and when you moved, it had to be explosive and decisive. And the art that we practice is a closing art. So even though it might be taught with separation for safety, the intent of the art is to close body to body and utilize weapons at those distances. And there are a lot of Filipino martial arts, and they all have their flavor and their direction and an emphasis, including, long range styles, just like you would see in China or Japan. But the two arts that we're talking about today, Serrata Eskrima and Pikiti Tirsa, with respect to you, those are both closing arts. So they were meant to go body to body and to work in confined space on the battlefield with edged weapons, because the primary tools, aside from, there were firearms in the Philippines, even all the way up, right? But there were other projectile weapons as well, but the primary weapons that are taught in Eskrima are the sword and the dagger. In some cases, rarely spear and shield. But a traditional Filipino warrior probably would have carried a spear in his hand behind his shield, and possibly hold a second sword in that same on that same shield, and have two longer weapons in his waistband, as well as a dagger, one or more. The Filipinos fought with armor, early brass chain link and carabao horn plate mail. They used helmets, and today, I think the training with the foil, which is a stick, wooden weapons, are foils for used for safety, to teach edged and metal tools. And that's something that's still lost in a lot of schools today, because they, to me, it's sort of like the quarterstaff in European combat training was meant to be a foil for two-handed swordplay. But and of course, people progress to blunt tools, and they have blunt tools in the Philippines as well. They train with in Pikiti Tirsa, you'll see people working with blunt steel, as well as wooden replicas, and today, obviously, plastic and resin tools top it off. But I guess the single biggest misnomer, and I probably receive a lot of hate for saying it, but the Filipino martial arts are not impact weapon arts primarily. Not in the history of warfare did they ever show up for a fight with a stick in their hand.
Yeah, the sticks are meant to be like what a bokken would be for Japanese swordsmanship. Like it's a wooden version of the tool. It's not the tool itself.
100%.
And I think people, like so many other things about training, right? This is a topic we should probably circle back around to. But people, especially people that don't have personal experience in unagreed violence, and I'm not saying that, combat sports aren't phenomenal to learn how to fight, because they are. And I think they're a valuable tool in your training, just like competitive shooting is a valuable tool in your shooting training, right? To learn how to fight with a gun. But a combat sport is still a cooperative event. Like, I'm agreeing to do these rules with you in this circumstance and this surrounding, right? And I think that people that haven't seen a lot of true violence often confuse in training the medium for the message. They look at the medium that they're using to get that training value, and they're not looking at the actual message it's trying to impart. Does that make sense? And you see that in like traditional martial arts all the time.
The Filipino martial arts, like most martial practices around the world, used foils for training for safety purposes. And that's why we see rattan and wooden tools, hardwood tools in some cases, as substitute for the metal weapons that were actually used in combat. In warfare in the Philippines, people showed up on the battlefield with a wide variety of edge weapons, swords, spears, axes. There was an entire range of fighting tools, none of which included the stick.
And I think it's interesting too that so much of what people think of when they think of those arts Just like when people think of like traditional karate, right? They think of kata. They think of these elaborate forms that don't seem to resemble real fights very much, or kung fu, kind of the same thing. And then for Filipino arts, people think of these elaborate, partner combination drills where you're doing the same combination over and over again. And I think people misunderstand, like I said, the message in that medium. Like that's not that set, that combination in practice alone. That's not meant to be the fight, right? That's meant to teach you how to do the individual techniques and to get used to responding to an opponent and their timing and all of that. But the fight's not going to look like that. And I think people confuse that a lot with pretty much everything combative, whether it's shooting or everything else. I don't know. What do you think?
Absolutely. Most Filipino martial arts begin with reactions to immediate threats. They're trying to train the eye to recognize those attacks, recognize that attacks as different from each other, and then sort of inculcate specific trained responses, short responses. So most of the Filipino martial arts movements at long range are on a single beat, and as you move closer, usually get that double tap thud, and the entirety of a string of movement is designed to fit in that double beat at close range.
Yeah, that broken rhythm going on the half beat, and like that kind of ties into like the traditional Japanese swordsmanship I did had 2-person kata, right? Had 2-person forms, but they were trained very differently from what people would think. When you were going up against somebody more senior than you, they would deviate from the form anytime you did something incorrect and you get whacked. And like I think it's kind of the same way with like the Sinawali stuff. You tell me, because you got a lot more experience at this than I do. But when I see somebody senior working with somebody junior, it's like that is a big part of the drill. It's like going on that half beat and changing the line of attack and getting people used to, rather than being lulled into this false sense of I'm repeating this exact same pattern over and over again ad infinitum, always kind of being tuned in to where people may deviate from the pattern and deviate from the rhythm. Is that an accurate assessment?
Right. They may come closer. They may attempt to sidestep or flank you. They may change the level, moving up and down. Adding movement-based variables primarily. And then I think another purpose of those continuous exchanges, exercises where you have a continuous exchange of force, is also to try to draw out sort of a flow state where and when it can happen, and so you have and then practitioners learn also to take sort of rote responses, or you begin to try to adapt your movement to a wide variety of alternative problems that are not in the initial in sort of the initial game that you're playing. And so the twofold intent: one, induce a flow state, try and get people out of their rear end and be fully attentive on the person in front of them, clear external focus, head in the game. And then secondly, to adapt to, sort of the not infinite, but near infinite, variation that happens in exchanges between people. It all looks the same, but it's all can be very different.
And that kind of, so I've had some really interesting conversations lately with a few different people about both of those things in a different context, right? A couple different contexts. Like, do you know Paul Sharp, retired suburban cop, teaches BJJ and used to do JKD?
I don't personally know him, but I think I've heard of him actually more vis-a-vis you, indirectly than myself.
Really good guy, very intelligent guy, very good trainer. And we were having a conversation about how getting a bunch of different, he called them looks, on a technique help you learn to apply it regardless of the circumstance. And the idea is, not to throw it in the exact same circumstance 5,000 times, but to throw it in slightly differing circumstances 5,000 times. So it's a little bit different every time, but it's the same technique. And he talked about it not just as a way of technical improvement, but as a way of learning to apply against an unwilling, uncooperative opponent better, right? Working with a variety of different sparring partners, training partners, and trying to make the same technique work, even though they're different, and figuring out, the way to make that happen. And that's kind of something I've been doing a deep dive in shooting training specifically for shooting competition. Is like, never running in certain kinds of drills, not for like the warm up and for like, I wouldn't say this should be the way you should train if you're still trying to work on your draw and your reload, you know what I'm saying? But when it comes time to like apply that in the context of a larger stage in a competition or in the real world and, in the variable situation of a gunfight, I think it's a really cool way to train that has better value. And it's never doing exactly the same thing twice in a row. Even if the targets are the same, even if, the engagement is very similar, you're making some difference every time you do it, even if it's very minor. And one of the guys that's like a real big proponent of this, he's a world champion. He also increases the complexity on each rep until he finds a failure point, right? So as long as he succeeds in what he was trying to do, he'll up the complexity just a little bit for the next rep. And it's in little ways. It's not like, in huge giant strides. It's in little bitty baby steps. And there's a lot of research into this kind of like interleaving training style that I've been reading. And basically what the studies are showing is that it is not as quick an improvement for learning a basic skill. Like you learn quicker in the beginning, doing more block style training. But then after that, if you put the time in doing kind of this interleaving kind of randomized training technique, you improve not only faster technically, but you improve as far as retention of technical application and being able to apply the technique in a wider variety of circumstances. And I think that stuff is pretty fascinating. I kind of geek out on how that works. And the other piece I think too is, so you're doing these patterns and they're a little bit different every time, right? But not only are you getting like a slightly different look on things every time you do it, but because you're changing those variables, you're learning the principles of the technique as opposed to just how to not just how to make, a by the numbers Arthur Murray dance steps, I put my feet here technique work, as long as it's exactly like that. For the young people out there, that's an old dance school where you put your feet on the painted footprints on the ground. Like a lot of guys may not even realize that reference, right? But, that's the way a lot of training is done, especially like, more lower level basic training. And I think there's some value in that in the beginning. But I think that if you're too afraid to deviate from that, you really hinder your performance improvement. What do you think?
So I think, yes, it begins with sort of a task list. You learn things by the numbers, and it's errorless training at the beginning. You don't want the student to make errors. You want them to perform the task list appropriately. But as you know, an expert doesn't follow task list anymore. He's looking at the entire situation, the big picture, and the details, and the decisions that emerge come out of the real timing and the real situation, and not the cognitive task list that you might have had. And I was just reminded that when you were leading the gun team, you did something that hadn't happened before. You wrote up an SOP for our tactical approach to raids and search warrants. That hadn't been done before, but what you were trying to do was teach that basic task list, the basic larger approach, and I think it has to begin there so that people don't make the big errors. But as you
Well,
move along with experience, you should be able to adapt your movement to a larger number of variables, to randomness, to different intensities and different problems. And that's something that can happen with exercises that are very simple, like the Sinwali exercise you reference is simple activities that can be those drills can be applied against each other. They can be changed with, as we mentioned, a variety of movement, forward, backwards, up, down, flanking, pressure, lack of pressure, following through on your striking or locking on the opponent's weapon. There are lots of also using those drills as a juncture to practice takedowns, tackles, entries, locks, transition, other tools. So everything comes out of the basics, kind of.
yeah, and I think it's certainly like not a new progression concept, right? Like
Mhm.
Japanese arts talk about shuha and ri, and it basically translates to like imitation, adaptation, and innovation. You know what I mean? Like, first you're just trying to make your technique look like your teacher's technique, even if, like, I'm 6'3" and I weigh well over 200 pounds. My wife is, just over 5 feet and weighs about 100 pounds less than me, right? Her technique as a shooter or as a martial artist, or even in lifting weights, it's not going to look like mine because we have vastly different bodies, right? But in the beginning, you're trying to imitate somebody regardless of how well their personal technique suits you, because you've got to learn the framework of that technique, and then you learn to adapt it to yourself. And then when you get really good, you learn to innovate and you learn to come up with new nuances and twists and tweaks and ways to do things. And I think you see that in music. You see that, like, look at a jazz musician, right? They've got to know the scales and the melody to do what they do, but they're hardly sticking with the melody, let alone a scale, by the time they're playing jazz,
Sure.
and I think it's the same way with all this stuff. Like, look at CQB, right? So, like, say you're a private in a line infantry unit, or you're, not on SWAT, but you're in a unit that does a lot of search warrants, right? Chances are your entry techniques are pretty simplistic and done by rote, if you're even doing them right at all, and you're following those steps exactly, and there's no deviation, you know. And then you look at somebody from, they don't call them SIF teams anymore, but they'll always be SIF teams to me, just like the Sears Tower is still the Sears Tower in my mind, right? We look at somebody on a SIF team or an SMU doing free flow CQB, and they're still following the same principles, but it looks so different than that basic beginner level, by the numbers, step here, turn here, do that. Even though it's the same principles, they've learned to kind of play off the scales and play off the melody like a jazz musician, right? And I think that, conflict is chaotic, right? Violence is chaos. It's not predictable, and it's not pretty, and it doesn't look like a martial arts movie. But the people that excel at it have learned to be very adaptive and unpredictable, while at the same time learning to see what the other person is doing. And I don't think you get that just by playing the scales.
No, it starts with the alphabet. It starts with the scales, but there are other issues there. You're trying to learn how to continuously target what you perceive to be your opponent or your enemy's critical vulnerability at all times. In order to maintain that pressure. Trying to ensure that when you're moving, you don't, go back. That your tension, as I said, is always outward. I'm gonna. Something just came to mind reading your book, and it was your reference to vision drives your shooting, right? And that's an obvious factual statement, but it also has a lot of depth, and it's helped. Human beings are visual animals, and our eye evolved to see three fundamental things, at least peripheral vision, and that's movement, gaze, target gaze, in order to detect both prey and predators in the environment. Our eye neatly detects when people watch us, and obviously we see this with women who can see a man glance at her from 50 yards, at her rear, right, because of her peripheral vision, 165 degrees. He thinks he's safely watching, but she detects it and looks towards him. So gaze detection is fundamental to human survival, detection of movement. And then lastly, the human eye sees through foreground background problems. We basically break camouflage. So we can see the silhouettes of shapes don't belong along structures or behind bushes, et cetera, because of that ability to sort of parse out what doesn't fit in that foreground background scenario. So weapons are like you're speaking of, where you're working in close proximity, from 2 arms reach to an arm's reach to moving body to body. The eye, everything starts with vision. Everything starts with your attention and soft focus on the other person, so that you can see them, the whole person from head to toe, in the course of your drill. And like I learned, like details that we learned about vision in my art. If my head is exactly upright without deviation, my cheekbones block some of my vision. And so if my nose comes down about 1 finger, I can now see you from your toes up to your shoulders easily. And you mentioned that weapons move quickly, but the shoulders and hips don't.
Yeah.
And so if I have a soft focus on your sternum, I can sort of passively watch your shoulders and hips and see where the threats are coming from and orientate. That point of orientation, that's reflexive human behavior. The head orientation reflex is always in competition with startle reflex, and it's the alternative, the high road to falling back on lower brain limbic system reactions. I mean, we didn't get to where we are, in the food chain because we resorted just to primitive reflex. Reflexes are in competition. There are higher and lower reflexes. Startle is lower. As a professional, you don't want to dwell in emotion as much as you want to dwell in your orientation to the environment around you. You want to see and you want to hunt. So that's that head orientation reflex. The eye leads the head leads the body. You move a finger, you've already used your eye and your head. It happens every time.
I remember very clearly. Remember that duty knife class that I helped you teach like way back in the day?
Yes.
I had a great time. Thank you for allowing me to do that with you. That was a very good learning experience for me as well, not just an experience in teaching. But you talked a lot about pre-attack cues in the opening part of that class. And that's something that, other people talk about it, obviously, in the tactical and defensive space, but it's something that people, I don't think, practice enough. They don't train enough. It's like so many other things. Having an intellectual or academic knowledge of something doesn't mean you can do it in application,
No.
So that's one thought. And then the other thought is, so that same thing about slightly lowering the chin is taught in Japanese swordsmanship as well, right? And then you see it in things as disparate as boxers, wrestlers, all sorts of combat sports. And people talk a lot, like boxers talk a lot about they're tucking the chin to defend the chin against a knockout. And while that's certainly true, I don't think that's not true. I think that's not the only reason they do it, even if they don't realize that's not the only reason they do it.
Correct.
You see what I'm saying? It also gives you the ability to orient.
Just like clenching your teeth. We don't just clench our teeth to protect, against fractures when we're being struck. We clench our teeth because it's sort of a primitive reflex that human beings have that goes back to when we also bit people in combat. So we sharpen our incisors by grinding our teeth, and when we bring them together, it's sort of an outside-in way of getting into a combative mindset. I think virtually all martial arts artists that I've spoken with, at some point they're taught to do that, but it's more than just clenching your teeth. It has a lot to do with establishing the frame of mind for the fight.
Well, and even sporting events that aren't combative events, like there are people in lifting sports that wear mouthpieces to get a certain mental effect for the lift, and they're doing the same thing you're talking about. They're just using an external aid to assist them in achieving that state, like what the clenching of the teeth does, I think.
Yeah. And there are combat veterans who have to wear mouthpieces at night because even outside of combat, they continue to do it in their sleep. So I think that's pretty common.
Yeah, no, I would doubt, and I would not doubt that it's incredibly common. And also, that's another segue. This is a rabbit hole we're not going to pursue because we're going to run out of time, but I got to mention it. A lot of responses that are positive adaptations for violence become negative adaptations when they're done away from violence.
I'm glad you brought that word up. So when it comes to mindset, for combat, there's a bimodal theory of aggression, and that's that. On one hand, we have affective violence, which runs the gamut from intermale competition over women, maternal aggression vis-a-vis their children, to protective instincts around their children, to violence that emerges out of anger or fear. And as a professional that's obligated to use force in the course of their job for the right reasons at the right time, you're in one of the few work areas where we move to contact, and we have to use physical force. We have to use violence in the course of our work. So what then is the difference? Well, like I said, the second kind in the bimodal theory of aggression, on one side you have affect, on the other side you have instrumental predatory aggression, right? And most instrumental predatory aggression in the animal kingdom is directed at other species. Wolves kill mice and rabbits.
My Mal puppy chases squirrels in the yard every day.
That's right. And we don't think twice about interspecies aggression because we know that the entire animal kingdom kills to eat, to survive. It's just part of the circle of life. But in the case of human beings, we become very concerned when it's within the species. And most of the clinical research, most of the cognitive psychology research looks only at sort of the antisocial variation of instrumental predatory aggression. Instrumental predatory aggression is cognitive. Lowered galvanic skin response, which means you have higher pain tolerance, potentially interest and mild excitement, even, because of the external focus on a target or on prey. And the difference between the police officer and the criminal, the difference between the soldier and the terrorist, is the orientation, the social orientation. That criminals don't have any consideration for the rights of others, whereas police officers and soldiers do. You have an ROE. We have rules for use of force. We use force in accordance with the law and social norms, right? And so we face due north, and they're going south, right? They kill because they can. They kill for profit because they feel like it, but not because they have care or concern or compassion for other people. And it's that pro-social orientation that is completely understudied in the predatory aggression literature. Completely
And
understudied.
this is actually looking at a topic I've been looking at a lot lately from a different angle, right? I had a conversation with a friend of mine that used to write for Black Belt magazine when that was still a thing. And he's of the opinion that people that do the sorts of things that you and I have done for a living rate higher on the sociopathy scale than the general population. And I don't even think he's necessarily wrong in a sense, right? Because I think we have the ability to kind of turn empathy off in certain circumstances when it's socially appropriate. I don't think it means we don't have empathy. You know, I mean, you can ask my wife, I cry in movies. I'm like the biggest softie away from those situations, right? But in those situations, I know that I can be ruthless. I know you can be ruthless. We've both seen it in each other when it's necessary, right? We were having this conversation, and he's a great guy and he's very intelligent. He was of the opinion that things like chivalry and Bushido existed so that people could justify their behaviors. But remember, he's an academic. He's never done this stuff for a living. I completely disagree. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't people that did justify their behaviors that way. Of course there were. There's bad apples everywhere, right? But I think those sorts of codes, there's ways they can be negative. Sometimes they're a mechanism of control so that the rich control the physically powerful. That is true. But there's a flip side to that. And the flip side to that is that those exist so that you don't lose your moral compass when you become used to violence, I think. And I think that as popular as it is these days to kind of be cynical and think of these things as being cheesy or valueless, I think that that's the furthest thing from the truth. I think that if you're going to spend a large portion of your life learning how to do violence to others, you better do your homework and making sure you only do it when it's the right thing to do. You know? And it doesn't have to be an organized code like, you know, Bushido or chivalry, but it's got to be something. It's got to be something that you use as your values. You know, I'm not an overly religious man, but it could be Christianity if that's your thing. Like, that's okay. But you have to have something that's going to keep you from crossing the line.
I think, you know, the word that you mentioned, control, and sort of the pejorative and the positive aspect of that word. I mean, when it comes to man's response to toxic stimuli, to aggression, to threats, to violence, we want people that rise to the challenge for the right reasons, that are committed to these, you know, to social norms, are committed to our understanding of the law, and to, in the case of, you know, police work, to your agency policy, right? We want that commitment, and we want them to have control over their circumstances, not, you know, to be able to exert social control, not just individual control, but also social control on others. And you know, at least our agency viewed just being there a use of force, right?
Yeah.
Before, and not just your voice, but just being there.
Yeah, presence alone.
But we've gone through I guess now we're passing through 10 years where we have a profession that's been the national whipping post, and you know, where the quality of our leadership at most of our major agencies deteriorated to the point where people with no command maturity occupy the highest positions, where they no longer value initiative, but rather inertia. You know, and we're basically, from, you know, we're in a state right now where our city leaders and even some national leaders no longer think that security is their first priority. You know,
And that's a problem, right? Because we are getting down the rabbit hole, but that's okay. That's a problem, because what is the purpose of the people who are entrusted with the use of force. It's to protect and to prevent disorder and chaos. It's to keep things moving in a positive direction in society on the small level. You know what I mean? I don't mean like, you're not a politician. That's not what I mean. But, to avoid mass looting or riots or people settling their differences with guns on the street corner. Like, that's what you're trying to prevent and avoid. And if that is not the priority in your job as law enforcement, if the priority in your job as a soldier is not to keep America safe and to serve America's interests overseas, potentially through the use of force, you have the wrong priority. If your priority as a cop is not to keep the people in society safe that cannot protect themselves, and to ensure that people get caught when they do something that is against the societal norms, like, that's your job. It doesn't always involve the use of force. And if you do it without use of force, that's great. But it could also involve the use of force. And people need to understand that sometimes that's necessary. And like, here's another thing that I don't, 2 points, and you and I have talked about these before down through the years. One is that people that are not skilled at violence invariably confuse an ability to do violence with a tendency to do violence, when they're actually two very different things. The same, the meme about the sheep and the wolf, right? And that's a very true thing, I think. And that's something that really people need to understand, right? And the other thing, the flip side of that, the bad guy side of that, is that those people you were talking about earlier that don't do violence for socially acceptable reasons, that do violence because they feel like it or because it helps them achieve their own goals at the cost of others. But those people, especially if they're seasoned and experienced in that world, only respect and respond to either tacit or implicit violence. That's it. Either violence or a credible threat of violence is the only way you will get them to change their behavior. And that doesn't mean I think it's okay to be a bully or to beat up on people for no reason. That's not my point. But when you stop somebody in the corner in a bad neighborhood in Chicago as a cop, and he doesn't believe that if you need to put hands on him, you won't, and you won't be able to do it effectively. Like, if he thinks that's the case, if he doesn't believe you'll be able to do it and you'll be willing to do it, he's not going to do what you say. Even if he pretends to in front of you, it's not going to happen. Right? And people don't like that, but that is a reality of the human condition. Some people are predators, and that's just, we can talk about the societal causes, whether it's society's fault or the family unit or how they were brought up or raised or the educational system. And there's probably some truth to all of that. But by the time they're broken, they're already broken. And if you don't have a police force that's willing to do within the constraints of the social and legal contract, that is willing to use force when needed and necessary and appropriate, you can have big problems, I think.
Well, I mean, incapacitation works. We know it does. It's just that we were taken down a road where they started to tell us that you can't arrest your way out of the problem. My experience in El Salvador over the last 10 years told me completely differently, that in fact, when the right people are incapacitated, society can breathe again, and they can be free from crime completely.
What's the most effective way to lower the homicide rate? Put the murderers behind bars.
That's right. That's right.
Behind bars are where they won't ever kill anybody again, one or the other. But I'm glad you brought that up, because I don't want to run out of time to talk about your training pursuits. So what have you been doing for the last 10 years? I know, but I want the listeners to hear about it.
So from 2015, I had a friend that was working on a national video surveillance project in El Salvador that started to alert me to the situation of the police officers there. They had a collapse of a gang truce that was sort of a bad faith agreement between government and major gangs in 2014. That with a new administration under President Sanchez Cerén continued to deteriorate, and El Salvador began to experience peak violent crime. So for a country of 7 million in 2015, I think we were peaking around 6,000 murders. And in that year, 63 police officers were targeted for assassination. And when I say that, most of us, we consider getting killed or injured at work in the line or in the course of duty. We all sort of have that notion that life is something of a cocoon and we can leave work and return home. Well, in El Salvador, the gangs were putting officers that were green lighted for killing under surveillance, identifying where they lived, identifying their pattern of life, determining ambush sites, and killing them on the street. So, and there was a lot of that. 63 funerals for an agency of about 22,000 officers plus their, civilian auxiliary is a lot of funerals to go to. Almost unimaginable. So this developed into a conversation with a lot of interested parties and stakeholders. It led to travel. It led to the development of an officer survival project to try to harden the officers when they were alone, when they didn't have the organic supports of their agency, how they could behave that would increase or improve their survivability. And it led to the development of a 40-hour course of instruction that we delivered over 10 years to about 1,100 officers, roughly. And we dealt with almost every specialized unit in their national police, but also patrol officers from every part of the country. Over that time, I had the chance to visit almost everywhere and see. It's a tiny country that you can drive top to bottom each way, 3-4 hours from a central location in Salvador, or to the ends, in 6 or 7. For the furthest travel, is not very far. The whole country is smaller than Illinois, so but beautiful. And I guess the first thing I'd like to say is I knew almost nothing about El Salvador, except for maybe hearing about peripheral protest activity in the little village of Chicago, maybe when I was in high school. So I didn't know very much about the Civil War. I didn't know about the peace accords after. I didn't know how they constituted their government or what the status of their national police was until I got there. But I was pleasantly surprised to see a lot of professional police officers, under-kitted and under-equipped, as you might expect, but very serious. And the vast majority, they stayed when it got really bad. They stayed even when their family members were threatened. They stayed despite, watching their colleagues get killed on a weekly basis. So you have to give them a lot of credit. That experience, I don't know. It took up everything I had, all my free time.
Yeah, you went down there a lot, and we talked about it a few times, and that's definitely something worth doing, without a doubt. And that's been my experience too, especially in Central and South America, when we were going down there before the towers fell and we were too busy going other places. Shit doesn't make the man. You know what I mean? And you see some people that really, they're professionals. They may not look like what we would think a professional would look like here, because we're used to high dollar kit and, new uniforms that cost what for them would be an exorbitant amount of money. But that's not what makes you a professional. And
No.
You see a lot of professionals down there. It's always cool to see. Now, you said that you're still doing it, but the priorities are going to change. Things are kind of shifting around.
Things have shifted a lot around because outside of war, it was the highest violence crime rate in the world. El Salvador had that prize. and today they're the safest.
Nice.
So there were about 80,000 documented members of major national gangs: MS, Handia, 18, Serenos, Revolucionarios. Probably 98% of them are currently incarcerated. And El Salvador in February of 2016, when I was there, peaked at maybe 28 murders a day and countless number of shootings. But today, 6 out of 7 days are zero homicide days. So that's something that Chicago hasn't had for probably 8-9 years now.
Oh yeah, maybe longer.
Right. So, right, Chicago is a city that had about 2. And when I talk about peak violence, 28 murders a day, Chicago, based on its population, exceeded that violent crime rate during the Floyd civil unrest. In the first 48 hours, we had roughly 28 murders and 47 shootings. So Chicago had a taste of what it was like day in, day out in El Salvador for a period of time.
But they've turned it around, that's pretty cool. Actually, that's really cool, without a doubt. Now, if somebody who sees this or is listening to it as an audio podcast wants to reach out to you professionally, like, is that something that your company would do, for other training? Is there time on your schedule for stuff like that? Or
I mean, I'm always trying to figure out where I fit and where I'm going to have the best outcome and what's good for both parties. So we've looked at, I mean, this whole thing started with South Korea, actually. So I was actually, before El Salvador, active with training projects in South Korea for several years, basically from 2011, 2012 until 2014.
I remember that.
And then we pivoted to El Salvador, and I have to very quickly thank a lot of very important people that helped with that project. Lawrence Lujan out of El Paso Police Department, he's in a command position there. Brian John, who was a DHS SRT member and also a trainer for the agency. Ray Hamilton from Chicago PD. There's a long Kevin Colhane lent us a hand. There are quite a few people from the Chicago area that assisted. So thank you guys.
Yeah, and there's some good guys in that list. I know a few of those guys myself. So if somebody did want to seek your services, how would they get a hold of you? How should they reach out to you and see about doing business with you?
They could email me. I think that's probably the best way to contact me at Cunningham at ittaonline.org. And so it's my first initial, last name at ITTA. So not too hard.
Cool. Well, anybody who's listening, who's entertaining the thought, I can tell you that I worked with Aaron quite a bit, and he is a consummate professional. So if you're looking for something he can provide and he's got the time to do it, definitely seek him out, because it would be well worth it. Thanks for coming on, man. It's been way too long since we talked, without a doubt. I'd be up for doing part 2 sometime if you want to do that. We haven't even scratched the surface on a lot of things.
I'd be glad to speak with you. This again, I'm honored that you brought me on your show. Very nice, and I hope your listeners get something out of this.
I'm sure they will. And this just reminds me, I knew that you would be a great guest for the podcast because of all the late night conversations we had about philosophy, tactics, and violence when we were working together. And that's all we did this time, is just had one of those conversations and just shared it with everybody else, which honestly is why I'm enjoying this podcast so much. I just get to talk about the things I like to talk about anyway, with the kind of people I like to talk to anyway. So it's kind of a win-win for me. I hope everybody enjoyed the episode and enjoyed the conversation with Aaron as much as I did. And I will talk to all of you guys again soon.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Way is in Training. Please come back again as we explore how training makes us better at our craft and better in our everyday lives. See all of you soon.